Então, hora de fazer a fisicultura, né? O passado foi de braço, eu não fiz a de perna, passei um descanso, agora é meia-noite e 46, acabei de comer ali um cup noodles, mas bora fazer, né? Então, é abraço de novo, resetou o rolê, como sempre. Não esqueci de botar uma coisa. E aí, como de braço, tenho que lembrar, é na parede primeiro, no coisa aqui primeiro. Depois o do chão, porque o do chão é até a falha final.
So then it might be a useful way to start to give us a bit of an overview of what the polling looks like in the UK at the moment.
Yeah, so the polling, I think obviously we've discussed this a few times. The polling is really strange in the UK at the moment. I mean, I hope I don't accidentally be listening to this podcast that Reform UK are still way out in front. But I think the interesting thing here is that for the last few months, Reform's polling seems to have been relatively flat, so holding at about 31-32%-ish in the polls. There's been discussion by academics for
Esses aqui pra você não ficar se balançando.
last year about what the ceiling of Farage's support might be. Because if you were to ask, if you ask
Bom, bora descansar agora 3 minutos. É assim que é a vida.
Farage gets a huge number of tens and he's quite popular, but he gets the most number of zeros as well, which implies at the very least that while he's very popular and while Reform UK very popular, there is a ceiling to that support in a way that might not exist for some other parties, because you might be able to attract people from other places, but because of the way that Reform UK is set up, it's so centred around Farage as a person, it'd be very difficult to sort of divorce Farage from the party itself in the eyes of voters. So we know that there is a ceiling of support for Reform. The question is where that is. I think there is a good case to be made that we're now at that ceiling or around that ceiling now that they're on 31-32%. So that's where Reform is. If we look at some of the other parties, Labour and the Conservatives are actually very close. They're in the high teens, 16, 17, 18%. Some polls sort of put Labour a little bit higher, but generally speaking, they're under 20% and in the high teens. Which is pretty devastating for both parties. I think the thing that I find the most interesting here is that Labour's line is still going down, and just as we've asked the question about where Reform's ceiling is, I think there's a fair question to ask where Labour's floor is. There'll be a certain number of people across the country whose generations of a couple of generations have always voted Labour, very working class areas. There are places where people will always vote Labour no matter what. And it's just how many of those there are in the country. Again, the fact that the line's still dropping suggests that the floor is lower than it currently is, but I suppose we'll find out soon. I think the most interesting thing in the polls at the minute is that the Greens are still on the ascendancy and have actually overtaken the Liberal Democrats. In the recording last week, they'd just the polling sort of just met, and as of this morning, the Greens have overtaken by a point.
Good job we came back a week later.
Yeah, exactly. I think the latest Find Out Now polling has put the Greens on something like 17 or 18%, and the Lib Dems down in 11 or 12%. So it's actually quite significant. I think in the context of this podcast, I think the question that is worth asking is, will all of this actually sustain in an election? And I think in the run-up to the 2024 election, one of the things that was quite interesting when discussing polling was did we genuinely think that the Conservative polling would be the actual in the election would be as low as the polling would suggest? And in the event, in the actual election, it didn't drop as low as some of the polls suggested. And I think one of the arguments we made last year was that when people go and vote, they're often answering a very different question to what they're being asked in polls. In polls, it's just what, in an ideal scenario at the moment, which party would you vote for? When you actually vote in an election, the question you're asking, there's a lot of other questions in your head.
Eu falecei daquele como eu fiz e no chão fazer 10. Vai tá morto nesse 10. Tá cansadão já.
It's more of a pragmatic question of which is the least worst option. And I think that will mean that a lot of this polling we see at the minute is probably not as extreme as it will be, as the actual vote will be in an election.
Yeah. So when you look at that polling graph, it's not something that would feel out of place in a sort of European country that does have proportional representation, where you have 4 or 5 parties, double digits, within not that many points of each other. So you sort of get this idea that maybe Brits are voting or thinking of voting as if we already are in a system that is more proportional than we currently have with first past the post. And I guess the question is, if that is the case, will the parties catch up with how the voters are sort of treating it? And so will we move to proportional representation? I know obviously Nigel Farage has long been a sort of supporter of it, given that understandably his various parties in the past have suffered as a result of first past the post. So if we are heading towards a reform government, that you would assume might be one of his first priorities.
Yeah, I think it's the same. If anybody in politics, for any party in politics, the only ones that tend to back proportional representation are the ones that would personally benefit from it. And prior to the general election last year, and obviously the Reform's rise in the polls, I think it would be sensible to suggest that Reform would benefit from it, and that Farage would therefore support proportional representation. The issue in the last few months is that they're so far out ahead that the party that looks most to benefit from first past the post at the moment is Reform UK. And I don't think it's terribly surprising that we can now actually see some comments from senior Reform UK figures that have suggested a weakening or dampening of support for proportional representation. So a good example of this was Zia Youssef, who's Reform's chairman, on the Coffee House Shots Live podcast. He said that I don't think PR has served Germany particularly well. I don't think it's serving France particularly well. Asked about his stance on proportional representation, Richard Tice stated that in theory we've always been a fan of proportional representation, but at the end of the day we deal with the cards that we've been dealt, and I don't see that changing in any way, which I think is quite telling.
Yeah.
That even just the way that that's phrased is we've always in theory supported proportional representation.
Now we're moving beyond theory.
Yeah, now we're moving beyond theory. I don't think that moving beyond theory is completely disassociated from the fact that they're going to benefit most. And just very quickly as well, when I say that Reform's going to benefit the most from first past the post, obviously what we've seen with first past the post, I'm sure a lot of people on this podcast will already be aware of this. In order to win big under first past the post, you need a concentrated vote. So being spread thinly across the UK will mean if you come second in a load of seats under first past the post, that's completely pointless. So in 2015, UKIP won a huge number of seats.
We had
Basically no seats. I don't think they won any seats.
Yeah.
Actually, completely 0 seats. Oh no, one. It was one. That was it. It was a former Conservative defector who retained his seat. So it was 1 seat despite millions of votes. However, if we look at some of the most recent, this was most recent as of last week, polling, we can see that Reform was on, I think this is YouGov's polling, Reform was on 27%, but if we actually put that into, if we calculate how many seats they win under first past the post, because obviously this was the most recent YouGov MRP poll, so we can do that. They won, I'd say 27% of the vote share. They'd win about 47.8% of the seats. So that's obviously quite a massive overrepresentation. If we look at Labour, they were pretty actually bang on. They would win about 21% of votes and 22.2% of the seat share. The Conservatives, one of the parties that had historically been the most ardent supporters of first past the post and had talked the Lib Dems down in 2010 from a more significant, I suppose, proportional representation referendum, they would win 17% of the vote share, but only 6.9% of the seats. Liberal Democrats would win 15% of votes and 12% of seats. And the Greens, again, this was a few weeks ago, because I think, to be fair, although this was about a week or two ago from YouGov, I think this still is probably one of the most recent MRPs, would win 11%. Obviously, they're polling it slightly higher than that now. They'd win only 1% of seats in the seat share. So,
crazy.
Given all of that, I don't think it's too surprising to, you can probably guess which parties support proportional representation. The Greens are obviously, in their manifesto last year, had supported proportional representation, and I would be very surprised if their position on that has changed
Yeah.
since.
Yeah.
I just think it's really surprising. Well, I think it's well, maybe not surprising. I think it's really interesting. Reform has changed the tune in the way that Anna has.
Yeah.
It's not particularly surprising, given obviously the way how many seats they win based on their predicted vote share.
Yeah, and the last election, 2024, was I think the least proportional result we've ever
Yes.
had. So we could be going to 2029 and have a similar result, just swing very much in the other direction to another party. I think it's interesting that you talk about the parties switching their views a bit. So there was some polling from the British Social Attitude Survey that found among the public 60% support for moving towards a more proportional system and only 36% supporting the status quo, and that 60% is the highest ever support
10
they've
ainda?
registered in that
Lá para
survey
2 que eu
for
tenho que coisar, né?
representation. They broke it down by party support, so voters of supporters of those parties, whether they support PR or not. And the Conservatives, even Conservative supporters, are now in favour. 52% of Conservative supporters now want to move to a more proportional system.
I wonder why.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
wonder why.
It's
I wonder why
quite
when they're
transparent,
polling at
but-
17% and they only predicted to win 7% of seats.
Yeah.
It's amazing how, even no matter how long-standing the belief in first past the post, the sort of short-term electoral benefit will turn any party.
Yeah, and I think previously, when you had power flipping between Labour and the Conservatives, even when the losing one of those two sort of suffered as a result of first past the post, they always knew that, well, in a few years, I'm sure we'll benefit from it again. But now I guess we're looking at, if we sort of project on from the current polling, you're looking at quite a big realignment, and those parties thinking, there's no guarantee that the pendulum's going to swing back in our favour. So maybe there'll be some crazy moves. Something I did mention in the last week's unreleased recording that I wanted to bring up again today was this idea that if we assume a reform-led government, whether it's minority majority, whether wouldn't necessarily achieve proportional representation, do you think there's a chance that a Labour government heading towards 2029, still polling in a really bad place, thinks there's a sort of last-ditch effort to win some, or to keep reform out of power, to win some sort of good favour from parties or voters usually on the left, that they might do a sort of last-ditch introduction of some kind of proportional system?
Well, just firstly, very quickly, I feel like I did a very long explanation previously. I didn't actually come to the point, which was no, I don't think reform would introduce proportional representation, mainly because of the if they win under first past the post, why would they introduce proportional representation? So just to put that to one side. On the question of Labour and whether they would introduce it at the last minute, it would come across as ridiculously desperate.
Yeah.
It would set the tone for that election of, we are losing and we're going to change we're going to move the goalposts at the last moment. And I think for big constitutional questions, such as voting systems, which is a big constitutional question, I don't think it would be right for Labour to do that, and I think they'd face quite severe opposition from all of the parties. Even parties that support PR, I think, would accept that the method of going about it as a last-ditch effort. And also on these sort of questions, it should. I think it's been under our constitution isn't codified, and it's constantly developing. And I don't know how developed this is, and I'm sure there'll be other actual constitutional experts who can answer this question. But the fact that we asked people in 2011 via a referendum whether we should switch to AV has set some kind of precedent, I suppose, and obviously the EU referendum, that questions of constitutionality should go to a referendum. And if Labour were to do that without a referendum, I think there'd be some constitutional questions at play there as well.
Especially as it wasn't in their manifesto.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's especially because it's not in the manifesto as well. They've got no sort of authority to do that. So I think they'd need to do a referendum, and they'd need a couple of years to actually, to come up with that and develop that. So I think that's probably unlikely, and if it was to, they'd get serious, or they'd receive serious backlash to that.
Yeah, I think the only other route I can see, sort of in the near future for PR, is imagine some kind of hung parliament where, I don't know, the Lib Dems, the Greens, are sort of the kingmakers, and they can sort of levy those demands. But obviously,
as the Lib Dems did in 2010,
they would hopefully realise what went wrong the last time, and I guess try and pushing
just
it harder.
very
but-
quickly on the AV referendum, the turnout was 42.2%. I think it was a particularly low turnout.
Yeah, it was also a really sort of shoddy proposal. Like even
Yeah, no
proportional
one really
representation advocates don't think it's the best
Yeah.
system.
And so, I don't know. I think, PR advocates may have been slightly stung by what happened in 2011 and exactly how that compromise happened. So I don't know. I see routes to PR being quite few in the near future, at least.
Just to sort of wrap up this main section, if we look at a more zoomed in level, in Wales next year they've got the Senate election, and that they're moving to a more proportional system than they had before.
Yeah.
And Reform and Plaid are sort of currently fighting for first place in that election, in polling for that election. So, but it looks like, based on the position of the parties in Wales, even if Reform did come first, because of the proportional distribution of seats, Reform probably would be locked out of power, because I'm pretty sure Labour, Plaid, Lib Dems and so on have said they wouldn't sort of want to put Reform in government in Wales. So that is a sort of example of how proportional representation can work to lock some parties out of power. But again, it's I think if you're introducing a system on that basis, that's not a very solid argument.
No, Reform probably looking at that and going, do we really want this in Westminster as well? And, the other parties, I think that there was a natural way in which they could work together. I think the Lib Dems and Labour could work together quite well. I think Ed Davey's whole approach so far has been essentially to try and just push Labour on issues that he cares about, social care being a key, one of the key ones. I think there's a world in which the Greens, if it was a hung parliament, I think there's a world in which the Greens would join a coalition, especially if it's to keep Reform out. Whereas, I've spoken about this before, I don't think Reform has any obvious partners. I know people bring up the Conservatives, but I remain more sceptical than most that they would actually work together. I think that there are some quite fundamental differences in attitudes. Even if we just look at it at the very surface level, as one of them has the tradition of conservatism, which is a supporting tradition and slow change, and the other one is literally called Reform and is looking to reform the system in a number of different ways. Of course, there'll be individual Conservative MPs that will align themselves in the same way that you have Conservative MPs that sort of defect to Labour. Obviously, I think there'll be more that defect to Reform, but I still think there are fundamental differences between the Conservatives and Reform that mean that probably won't work together. So Reform introducing a proportional system, it just means that they'll probably end up with fewer seats and no natural coalition partner. So I still really remain sceptical about Reform's move. And again, looking at Wales is another good example.
Yeah. So we'll come back in, how many years is it now? 4 years and 3 or 4 years and see if we're right or wrong on that. So we'll wrap up the main section there. But before we move on to a very exciting cabinet review, I would love to promote our brand new book, Assembly Required. Now, you may have noticed a very clean cut earlier in this episode, where Ben and I probably shifted positions and looked slightly more out of breath than we were before, because we just got a big delivery of hardback copies of our book, which is very exciting. The office is filled with cardboard boxes filled with these books.
Yes, please help us empty out the office of the hardbacks.
So they will be going out sort of imminently, probably by the time this comes out, we'll already be sending some off. We've talked about it before, but if you don't already know, this is a sort of a coffee table book filled with really beautiful photos and sort of stories that we've written about parliament building from around the world. I think we cover most continents, lots of big countries, lots of small countries with all sorts of interesting stories. The other exciting thing is that this isn't the only Assembly Required product we have. We also have Assembly Required wall calendar and desk calendar, which you can buy individually or as a bundle with the book for a discounted price, which I highly recommend. So in the wall calendar, for example, you flip to a month, let's look at January, you've got, each month has one of the parliaments from the book, and you've got some extra photos and words on the other side. The fun thing about this is that it helps you stay up to date with the political world. It's got certain anniversaries, it's got scheduled dates for elections next year, all through 2026, so you can sort of stay on top of things. And I think it's fun to sort of flick to your own birth month and find out what Parliament you've got on your birth month.
Yes.
So Ben, I'll do it for you. You are
April.
Almost said May there. I should have known. April, you've got Hungary. That's the front page.
It's
Front
a
page of the
beautiful
book.
parliament.
It's a very good one
It's
to
a
have.
really, it's one of the parliaments that I've actually seen in person.
Yeah.
It's
And
quite nice.
you wrote that.
I did. I did write that piece, yes.
Yeah. That's very exciting. I won't show you too much more of the inside. Because
Yes.
obviously we want people to get it
I would
themselves.
say on the book itself, we spent a good amount of time before we even started writing it, looking at different parliaments, and one of my main jobs in the production of the book was writing some of the stories that accompany the very, very beautiful pictures. And I had a look through parliaments all over the world and tried to find some really interesting stories, and they're the ones that we've included. And we've also tried to we put a good effort in to try and make sure that we're not just going with the parliaments that everyone sort of immediately thinks of.
Fazer do chão agora, né?
Parliament, I think most people would think of when you think of a really interesting parliament building. But I think fewer people.
Vai tá magro, ó. Outro dia sem fazer. Nem faz diferença. E eu, quando a pessoa faz também, não faz diferença.
All over, we've got some really, really interesting stories there. The history of how they come about. I think Northern Ireland is another good one. We've got all of the home United Kingdom nations in there. So we've got Westminster, we've got Welsh Parliament, Scottish Parliament, Northern Irish Parliament as well, and Ireland as well.
Yeah,
which is another element to that. So no, I think it's a really, really interesting book. We've put a lot of time into it, put a lot of effort into even just selecting the topics before we even started writing any of them. So I think it's if you're watching this podcast and you're interested in the sort of things that we talk about, not just here, but on all of the other channels as well, on World Leaderboard as well, I think there is definitely going to be something in there.
And it's a real mix of politics and architecture, so if you're inspired for those things, it's a great Christmas present for someone who is into those things or just for yourself if you want them. And like we said, go to toolong.news, link in the description.
Yes.
You can see all the assembly required products. Like I said, we've got hardback and paperback editions, and you can get a bundle with a reduced price if you get the book and the calendars.
Yes.
So yeah, go and check it out. And now we're going to move on to the cabinet review. And occasionally in this podcast, the cabinet review is a bit cheeky. It looks to people who aren't necessarily in cabinet
We've done
or
shadow
adjacent to
cabinet
cabinet.
before,
Yeah, we have.
which is really cheeky.
But this is proper cabinet review stuff. We're going to look at Rachel Reeves' speech last week. That's Chancellor Rachel Reeves, to be in anticipation of the budget, which you will be able to tell me the date of. I hope.
It's the end of November.
End of November, so a couple of weeks away still.
Yes.
So Rachel Reeves gave this big speech last week. I think they called it a scene-setting speech,
I believe
which
they
is
did.
quite fun phrasing.
Yes.
It was basically laying the groundwork for her to increase taxes in some form at the budget.
Which, when we're talking about being cheeky,
Yes.
I think that
It's
meets the
pretty cheeky.
definition.
Yeah.
Considering how much time they devoted in the run-up to the election and since, reassuring that they will not be increasing taxes on what they refer to as working people, which has tied them in all kinds of knots. And,
So the big three taxes they pledged not to increase in the manifesto is are income tax, VAT, and national insurance. The current speculation, and it seems to, I've seen most outlets sort of talk about this as if this is what's going to happen, but to certain degrees, that she will increase income tax by 2 pennies in the pound, and then at the same time reduce national insurance by 2p. That's employee contributions for those under about £50,000. So the idea is that the increase in income tax is going to be offset for most working people under 50,000. Well, for working people under 50,000, and that will be their sort of, yes, technically we increased income tax, but it's sort of in the spirit of the promise because we lowered national insurance at the same time.
Yeah, and so what the whole point of this is that it shouldn't actually
24 estava em
functionally
quanto?
increase the
Estava em
amount of
21 quando eu fui.
people under £50,000
3 a
are paying
24.
because they're offset.
É,
What it
por
will
aí.
mean though is that pensioners and landlords will start paying. Will have to pay more in national insurance. So that's.
Well, no, they will pay more.
Yes. Apologies, the other way around. Yes, in that. So they'll pay more. Either way, they pay more.
Yeah.
And the idea behind this is that it's that's what working people get at.
Yeah.
So they're going to claim that landlords and pensioners aren't working people, therefore it's not breaking the promise. Which is, I mean, it's not technically they promised not to increase any of those.
Yes.
So in a technical sense they have broken it, but I would agree with you that in the spirit of it, if it is a 2p increase in income tax but 2p reduction in national insurance, I would agree that it's within the spirit of the promise because those two groups aren't working equal,
I think
and therefore
the difficulty is that when you start having to get into that like justification and talking about the spirit of the manifesto pledge, you're already sort of on the back foot. And the opposition parties, the press.
Eu só faço
they're
6 e
not
morro,
gonna be
velho. Que fraqueza na vida é essa vida, velho.
And I think
Porra,
it is quite
caralho.
critical of Labour on this because they made that promise in the manifesto and they kept making it after the election, and it's a sort of self-inflicted bind they put themselves in. So I think it's fair to say you might have a position that yes, it is right to increase taxes in some form and raise revenue, but the problem is in the first place.
I think this is it. The issue, any way you look at this, the issue is that they made that promise in the first place. And they can come up, Rachel Reeves can come up with as many different get-outs of, well, you know, it was Putin's invasion, it was the legacy of the Conservatives, it was fuel tariffs, Trump's tariffs. You can come up with as many of those as you like, but the whole nature of promises is that they're immune to changing circumstances.
Yeah, I think that's what is baffling to me is that so in Rachel Reeves' speech, she talked about how much had changed in the last 12 or 16, 18 months, however long it's been since the election. And that's true, lots has changed, but they can't seriously make the case that they didn't know what the world's sort of economic situation, and the country's economic situation was going into that election. It hasn't changed so fundamentally since then that they genuinely believed, I think, at the time that they wouldn't have to increase taxes in some form. That's my take on it, at least.
Yeah, I generally agree with you, and I think the thing I absolutely agree with you on is they shouldn't have made this promise. I think it was quite clear at the time that the fiscal situation was difficult, and promising not to increase taxes seemed like a crazy sort of promise to make, given how difficult things were. So that was mad. But I still, if that is the main change in the budget, I would agree with the general point that it's within the spirit of the promise, even though it technically does break it.
Yeah.
But irrespective of that, it will, as you say, infuriate various sectors of society and the press.
Within the Labour Party, there's already sort of unhappiness among MPs and parts of the Labour movement about this. Not necessarily just at the very principle of increased taxes, but because of the broken promise. There's one Labour figure this morning warning that Labour faces a Lib Dem style collapse if they do go ahead and increase taxes. And you know, the sort of 2015 Lib Dem collapse post tuition fees saga. And I think there's a lot of people in Labour very worried about it. But then I don't think Rachel Reeves can turn around and say, well, what do you want to do?
This is the other thing I was going to say, that given the current situation, and I know there'll be a lot of people, I think even in the comments section, which will be using the word, you know, wealth tax, there were other things that they could have done. And I am sympathetic to those calls, but outside of some other really big introduction like a wealth tax, I think that they are in a really, and just to be clear, I think they've ruled out a wealth tax. When the Andy Burnham speculation was going on, I think they did a thinly veiled attack on Andy Burnham saying we're not going to be doing something like a wealth tax. So outside of that, they have very few options sort of open to them because of that promise. And again, the point here is they shouldn't have made that promise, but outside of that, I also think just on the speech itself, I think it's kind of a crazy thing that Rachel Reeves even made that speech when she did. Because it's almost a tacit acceptance that this budget is going to be very controversial. It's almost preempting the backlash to it. And I think that anybody watching that speech should be thinking, so what the hell is in this budget? If she's feeling the need to defend it, you know, a couple of weeks before, or 2 or 3 weeks before,
that's why I think if they knew that tax rises were going to be inevitable, they should have started laying the groundwork a lot earlier than 2 weeks.
Yes. It's a last-ditch attempt to sort of change the narrative, isn't it? Because if you allow that, if you don't lay that groundwork, the taxes are probably going to increase, and it just comes as a bombshell. It's going to be a lot more devastating on the day, especially for them, because there's no prior expectation. So it is expectation setting.
So last week of November, some combination of us will probably be on the podcast talking about that budget
Yes.
and how it's gone down.
Yeah.
So that's
I'm going to predict not well.
yes.
Yeah.
There's not going to be many happy people.
No.
So that's the cabinet review. I think we should wrap this episode up by talking about the BBC.
Yes, let's.
So by the time you're watching this, you'll definitely have seen the news that the Director General of the BBC, Tim Davie, and the CEO of BBC News, Deborah Turnus, have resigned. Sort of amid, well, I don't even know where to start, but the sort of immediate crisis that prompted them to resign was in relation to Trump and the editing of a BBC Panorama sort of feature that edited the way edited Trump's January 6th speech in a way that made it sound like he was directing people to go and fight at the Capitol, and they sort of sliced different sections of that speech together for sort of dramatic effect, I would guess. And I don't even know where to go for that.
Yes, so in that particular, so this was a Panorama episode that actually aired a little while ago.
Yeah.
It was a report by Michael Prescott. It was a former independent advisor to the BBC's editorial guidance and standards forum. He'd written a report, and that was leaked last week, and that had criticised some of the decisions made by the BBC.
Esse é o final, então bora.
News and obviously that Panorama episode.
Até a falha, né?
Which was,
Só vou doce, vai dar morto.
biased, I suppose. As you point out, the most damaging part of that report was the splicing together of that BBC Panorama episode. And this caused quite a bit of backlash last week. It was the Telegraph that broke it.
Yeah.
And then Donald Trump obviously read about this and had openly criticised the BBC, continues to criticise the BBC over the weekend.
Boris Johnson got involved as well.
Boris Johnson got involved and then had a bit of a spat with Nick Robinson. Yes, Nick Robinson, who sort of tried to defend the BBC. I think he is the only. I think he was pretty much the only.
20? É monstro, hein? Caralho.
And his argument was essentially that all organisations.
New recorde do nada, out of nowhere. Mas é isso aí. Valeu por hoje. Tomar um whey ali e dormir.